Hello, yeah, watching Line of Contact talk show, and again we have English language program, and we are very happy and very honored to have distinguished guests today in our office. So I'd like to introduce you and Peter Ubertaccio.
Very good. That's right.
Yeah, that's good
that's
pronunciation.
Good.
Okay, I tried hard. From Stonehill College, and we have also Benjamin Cole, who is from Simmons College, both from US. Welcome. And
thank you.
Good to have you within us, because it's a rare chance when we have distinguished academicians who can also share some ideas, and we can discuss things that are not on our TV. So we try to use all these chances to invite people like you. So thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Yeah, and to start with, I'd like to ask you, we have this hot topic now, which is American domestic politics, especially elections. And I know that both of you are professionally interested in that. So what's going on? Maybe, yeah, because, you know, we have all this kind of pictures and people, right. and when you are looking from miles away, I'm not sure that we get the whole kind of understanding of what's going on. Maybe we start from you, because or maybe from Peter.
Sure.
Yeah, from Peter. Yeah.
Happy to. So we are, you know, at the end of the kind of first part of the presidential election, which is choosing the nominees for the two major political parties. It's a fairly open process conducted by small local elections in the various states.
That's you call primaries, right?
Primaries and caucuses, and they employ different methods. At the end of that process, the two parties have chosen a nominee. They'll be formally nominated at their political conventions next month. So that's how the process is played out, and that's where we are. What makes this very unusual in American politics is that we have two nominees who are really, really unpopular. Their negative approval ratings are very high. If Hillary Clinton wasn't facing Donald Trump, she would be the most unpopular major party nominee in history.
Really?
But she is facing Donald Trump, and he is the most unpopular presidential nominee.
But I mean, unpopular, you mean that there were surveys, or there was a public opinion survey? It's not just out of the blue. That just
No. Consistent polling has had Donald Trump showing that he's quite unpopular among the general population. The way that American presidential nominations work, you can win a nomination by winning a small but steady percentage of the primary electorate, particularly in the early primary states. Other candidates, he happened to face a very crowded field in the race for his party's nomination. And so they were splitting the vote in a variety of ways, and he was appealing to a very small segment. Candidates dropped out, he started to increase his margins, and we end up with Donald Trump as the Republican nominee. So that procedurally is how it's working, but I think at the heart of your question is, you know, the politics behind it, and what we're seeing is something that we have seen before in American politics, but we've never seen it rise to the level of a major party nominee. He's run a very divisive, very ugly political campaign that is normally not the way one wins a nomination, when you at least make attempts and overtures at being inclusive. And so we're seeing something that looks very dark in American politics.
But that's something new, or it was predictable that some things like that might happen due to polarization, due to other maybe structural causes?
So, I mean, I've seen a lot of the same polarization in American politics over the last 10 years that I've seen actually in countries where we're more used to seeing it, that are democratizing or recently democratized. But I don't think it's new. I think what's new about the Trump campaign is that you have a major party candidate who's supposed to be representing the mainstream United States, who is giving voice to these, as you put it, sort of ugly or dark ideas, and is openly making statements that reflect bigotry and talking about banning Muslims from the United States or traveling to the United States. That's not new. I mean, that's sort of part of American political territory. But in the past, norms have prevented people from saying it. It's been taboo to say those sorts of things because they're hateful. And
But why that happened? Because of the situation in the world, like because of the migration crisis in Europe, because of the maybe economic crisis, or why these ideas were used to be marginal, now they become, well, if not front row, but quite already normal for people to hear. But maybe 10 years ago you couldn't say something like that publicly, being a nominee from any party.
I'm not sure all of those views are marginal, and there are a lot of different ones that he represents. And he is the only major party nominee, certainly in my lifetime, who has been overtly appealing to racism and misogyny and bigotry. And many of us were surprised at the response. I mean, we knew that those things existed, and other candidates at other levels have used them. No one's used them quite to the same effect, and very few have been as explicit as Trump has been. So I think a lot of us have been taken aback by the degree of loyalty of his supporters and his ability to continue to win despite those kinds of appeals. So I think there's some mainstreaming of those views that is that this election has demonstrated, that exists. But I do think you mentioned a variety of factors. I think they all play a role here. There is, fear is a powerful motivating factor, and Donald Trump is better at stoking fear, real fears, and the many imagined fears that he has discussed and raised. And he's been able to use that to really masterful effect. It's very dangerous, obviously, but I know of no other candidate who's really been able to touch on all of those fears. The fears of the economy, which are real. We've had economic growth. The country is actually doing quite well, but it's been it's not been great. And there's general fear about the future, and Americans are quite pessimistic. Americans view most of their major institutions negatively. There is the world environment that is disconcerting. There are our own internal environments, and when you can link them to external forces that seem scary to people, then Trump has really been able to use that to great effect. And when we saw all of this come together recently, when there was another mass shooting in the United States, the fear of radical terrorism that is in the United States, even if that doesn't seem to be what's going on here, it seems to be a person with some disorders who may have said something that makes us think it's radical Islam when it's not. But he's able to pull that. Normally after an event like that, we see politicians of both parties, they tend to come together. They believe in unity at those moments of crises. And what we saw after the Orlando shooting was there wasn't even an attempt at unity. And I think that represents something very troubling. That
may be what you said about polarization. Would you please a little bit kind of elaborate on that? What do you mean by polarization of society and how it's maybe manifested in these particular elections?
Yeah, and so in the United States there are actually pretty clear structural reasons for why our legislature in particular has become more polarized. That have to do with how congressional districts are drawn and the political process behind that. In short, the story there is that fewer and fewer seats in our Congress are actually competitive. So instead of a Republican running against a Democrat for a seat, you see a Republican running against a more extreme Republican or a Democrat running against a more extreme Democrat in this primary process. The result of that over time is that the Republicans in Congress become more extreme and the Democrats in Congress become more extreme. In the Republican Party over the last few years, since really the rise of the Tea Party in 2010, I think, you've seen that party fracture into quite distinct factions. And the Tea Party faction, now the Freedom Caucus inside this Republican Party, has been, more so than I'm familiar with in American history, willing to shut the government down to get what it wants. It's openly talks about eliminating government services. And so that represents an extreme view of the Republican Party that is increasingly large enough that it can stop Congress from acting on legislation. And so that means that the Speaker of our House, which is a prominent political figure, controls what laws get passed in important ways by controlling the agenda, is now beholden to a fairly small, actually, faction within that party, but without whom you can't control a majority of the House. And so structurally, we have forces that are facilitating more extreme views rising into a mainstream microphone, right? In the House and in political advertisements at now the national level with Mr. Trump. I think more generally it reflects demographic trends in the United States that we're increasingly seeing the alignment of divisions that previously cut across each other. And so race is increasingly connected to poverty, crime, violence by the police. And I think for Mr. Trump supporters, for example, you increasingly see white, lower middle class to upper middle class people who have been negatively affected by the improvements in the economy, that they've been shut out in a lot of cases, who are opposed to the progressive social movement that's been fairly successful in the United States, that we've seen gay marriage become considered to be constitutional and legal in all 50 states. Those things combined mean that this particular group feels afraid of the future, and I think feels increasingly like they are being targeted, or that their sort of way of life, which they associate with American identity.
I see. That's why maybe even his slogan, right, and make America strong again.
Make America great again.
Great again. So it has all this also sentiments of the maybe very particular group.
A whiter America. The country's changing demographically, and it's changing rapidly. And so there are the groups that Ben is looking at or discussed, these kind of white, unemployed, lower to middle class white voters see the country changing, and that has generated a lot of fear. They also, in addition to the factors that Ben discusses, we've ended up with a very unusual media environment where a lot of folks who believe something can now turn to a media outlet who just reaffirms their beliefs. Fox News is a very good example of this, where it kind of reiterates a narrative that may not always be accurate, and this allows folks to simply focus on the things that they already believe and to double down on those beliefs.
Right.
And Trump does well among that core group of supporters, and so he's been able to appeal to folks. And the difference with Trump, and these appeals are not new, but no one's ever been quite so forward about it. And the country is changing. It will be less white. There's no going back. It is more open to women's rights than it has been. It's more open to gay rights than it has been. And so he's been able to appeal to people who are fearful of those kinds of changes.
But then, it's kind of a difficult question. Of course, no one knows if Ms. Clinton or Mr. Trump will eventually win, because as far as I can follow, they go kind of nose to nose, right? Or you have some trends now. More.
Opinion polls this early in a presidential election you have to be very careful about trusting them. Election is in November, and it's the summer. School is just letting out. People are thinking of a lot of different things, and they have an impression of both candidates. And the way the American presidential election is run, a candidate has to win the Electoral College, and you win that by winning various states.
Right.
So a national poll that shows the race close is an important snapshot, but it doesn't tell us what we really need to know. So when we look at the 50 states, which states is Hillary Clinton likely to win? Which states is Donald Trump likely to win? You need 270 electoral votes. And if you just start adding up the electoral votes of the various states, Hillary Clinton begins very close to 270 electoral votes. And it is more likely than not that the Democratic nominee, whoever it will be Hillary Clinton, but it could have been somebody else. The Democratic nominee starts with an advantage.
Well, but then the question is, okay, we understand why Donald Trump is not the best candidate, maybe, or not, why it's not very much supported, but why Hillary Clinton has such a low ratings?
So the Clinton name carries with it more than Secretary Clinton's personal accomplishments. So it
might be an advantage as well.
Among some, it is. Among others, it's not. And I think part of the reason why in recent polls Donald Trump's support levels have been so much higher and his support levels were during the primary process, is that if there's one thing that can unify American conservatives, particularly the Republican Party, it's a visceral disgust and contempt for the name Clinton, which she carries with her. So even though Secretary Clinton was incredibly popular when she was Secretary of State, now that she's a presidential candidate, I think the sort of symbol of the name ties to with policies of her husband, with a sort of general representation of progressivism and liberalism in the United States, which again is scaring, actually, this conservative community that's increasingly, recently is actually sort of breaking away from Trump, but for a while seemed to be unifying around him.
But there is no gender issue. Oh, there is a gender issue.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. The fact that she's the first woman to be nominated by a major political party plays a role here. She's also been around Washington for decades.
Right.
She is a well-known figure, and when her husband was elected president, she was a very active, very assertive first lady, and she kind of upended the norms of what had been traditional for first ladies. And so from the moment she came to Washington, before she had done anything, she was developing a narrative about her and allowing conservative critics of her husband to rally around that particular narrative. And that's been going on for quite a long time. I think that you can't fully separate gender politics from this. And the Clinton name was extraordinarily helpful to her. Her own political accomplishments, regardless of her name. She, as a senator, as a Secretary of State, and a two-time presidential candidate, helped her win the Democratic nomination, but not without a very difficult fight. So it is. She's also an unusual figure.
Yeah.
But I think that gender helps to explain a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. But then just a very brief thing about Mr. Sanders. I think he himself is also a very extraordinary person and maybe something new to American politics, at least from outside, that to us he's kind of too left. And that's surprising. So I don't know if you have the same feeling.
I do, certainly. I mean, what we saw in this election cycle is something really extraordinary. The Republicans are about to nominate a man who has really no relationship to their party. Now, he does line up with some of their policies, but he's not a party person. He's never been elected to anything. He had been a Democrat before. It's an unusual thing to give your party's nomination to someone who's not really a member of your
prominent
party.
kind of party thing.
On the Democratic side, we saw the same thing, that the person who offered the most significant challenge to Hillary Clinton is not a Democrat. He is an independent member. He is a socialist from Vermont who had not been a member of the Democratic Party. The way that the institution of the Senate works, the Democratic Party in the Senate allowed Bernie Sanders to caucus with them, and that makes sense because he's closer to them on many issues. But he's not a member of that party, and he came very close to winning that party's nomination. So this represents on both sides something really quite unusual.
Right.
I mean, what that I think reflects is sort of or distrust or contempt for the established party platforms. And Trump in the last couple of weeks has been actively trying to court Sanders supporters, despite their very different policy positions, both symbolically represented massive change. I'm actually not sure what the way things are done, but I think sort of just symbolic distaste for serving politicians.
And you also see that young people actually voted for Sanders during the primaries. That means that there is a need for some policy change or making their voices maybe mainstreamed somewhere or heard somewhere, and that's very possible. There may be Latino or Hispanic population was part of their voters, or black people are part of the voters, or it's not so.
It's not so clear. So Bernie Sanders did well among the millennial generation, younger voters. But the storyline in part is, well, he was doing extraordinarily well among that group, but their numbers in turnout wasn't really that great, and so he was appealing to them, but he wasn't appealing to voters of color. And so when you looked at the breakdown in primary elections, Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders by very wide margins in states that had a big percentage of communities of color. And he did well she beat him by, I think it was, I might get this wrong, but 30 points in a state like Florida, which is one of the most significant states in the union. And so I do think his support was somewhat overstated. She really, defeated him by a pretty significant percentage in places like Florida, which is really important to the general election. But having said all of that, there was this appeal among younger voters who I think generally don't find their aspirations being met, not only in the way that the two parties work, but in the way that the political system works, and that is a much larger challenge.
Yeah, may I ask you a question? That's also more of reflection maybe, but when now we follow Hollywood and we see there are so many films coming out against banks, bank systems, Wall Street, and I'm not totally sure what goes on behind the curtains and how because I feel that all these films are reflections of some deep processes that go within the society. So what goes on? Maybe and maybe all these young people who rebel, maybe not just Occupy movement, but the others, they are looking for something new or to downgrade this capitals that do exist. What's going on and how it reflects maybe in the elections as well.
I mean, so one issue that occurs to me that I think is reflected in popular culture,
right,
focus on things like banks, and it's something that I think actually Sanders was able to capture pretty effectively. Problems in the United States around healthcare costs, particularly the cost of higher education. So young people now are graduating with debts that are similar to the amount of money you would spend on a house in their early 20s, which is dramatically affecting their chances of reaching employment. At the same time that the American economy is more unequal than it's been. And so they're entering professional life with a massive amount of debt. The economy is still recovering, and so job prospects aren't very good. And they're being presented with more wealthier people that control most of the wealth than actually they've ever seen before, right? And I think Sanders did a really good job of capturing that sense in young America that the system is somehow inherently unfair. And I think particularly the student loan issue is what appealed to so many people in their early 20s who were walking into life with $75,000 to $100,000 in debt.
I think that's right, because a previous generation, the accumulation of student loan debt has been happening for a long time, but these young voters were old enough to remember that the financial collapse in 2008.
8, 9, yeah.
And so what they found is a lot of their parents believed, given history up to that point, that the value of their home would exceed what they owed on their home mortgage, and that the parents could use that value, that equity, to help pay for college. Overnight, in some cases, quite literally within weeks, the values of their parents' homes plummeted. And these are folks who had done nothing wrong. They had been paying their mortgage. They had been doing everything that you're supposed to do. And suddenly the values of their home not only did they have more value than they owed, they had less value than they owed, and have been unable to get that value back since then, and to the extent that they thought they would need in order to send their children to college. So you end up with more debt than they might have otherwise have had personally. And at the same time, they see this growing inequality, and they see it happening under, again, it's been happening for a while, but it's been 8 years of a Democratic president. Mm-hmm. In Massachusetts, where we're from, we have the greatest rates of inequality of all the states, and we've had a Democratic progressive governor and legislature for 8 years. So their loyalties to the Democratic Party cannot be taken for granted, because they've watched this happen on a Democratic watch.
I see. And then the final question about it. Is it dangerous if Donald Trump will be elected president, or kind of institutions and systems are still in place and they might fix it somehow?
Well, I don't think that they could fix it. I think that it is, by my way of thinking, it's very dangerous, because he represents something very ugly. We don't know how he will govern, because we have no experience with someone like Donald Trump. He has no track record, and he has no substantive policies. So that by itself, I think, is dangerous. So we really don't know what he will do. There's reason to believe that he doesn't necessarily believe everything that he's saying, but I don't view that as an excuse. I view that as something to be troubled by. Institutions can, as we've seen, they can prevent really bad ideas from happening, but they can also prevent really good ideas from happening. You can end up in a situation where nothing much happens. But having said that, and that might be a good thing in terms of trimming his worst excesses, we have also seen under the last two presidents more power being accumulated to the executive.
Right.
There's no reason to think that a President Trump or a President Clinton is going to willingly give that up or send it back to Congress. And so I think Trump will inherit a presidency that in some key ways is much more powerful than it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. I think with a man with the reckless temperament that he has, sitting in the Oval Office is a very, very dangerous thing.
So you seem to agree.
Well, so I mean, I think Peter and I agree on the end. I see it slightly different. What troubles me is slightly different. For one thing, I'm not convinced actually that a Republican-dominated legislature, assume one survives this election, will ally itself with Trump. And in fact, he seems to be damaging right now electoral chances among Republicans. And so it could be that actually what normally would be a sympathetic legislature to a Republican president could be an antipathetic one. And actually, in fact, institutions stopping him to any degree is that what we've seen so far with his behavior is that he's perfectly willing to pick minority groups to blame for events that have nothing to do with those groups. And my concern about him being stopped is, let's say that he sort of tries to carry through on his intention to build a wall with our border with Mexico.
Right.
When he can't, because he won't be able to, who does he blame for that? He's been inciting violence at his campaign events. And he's made it clear that he'll actually defend people legally who perpetuate violence against minority members. So what happens if he starts blaming minority groups in the United States and calling for violence against them, claiming that they're un-American or traitorous or preventing...
But then do you have some kind of institutions like Supreme Court who can simply stop it? Or?
Well, the Supreme Court can't simply stop it. The Supreme Court in the United States is a largely reactive institution. It has to have a case before it. And it's pretty rare that cases end up before it quickly. They work their way up through the system. So the court is not, there may be cases that emerge, but that will take a period of time. We have seen in his candidacy a willingness to incite people to violence, incite people to action. As president, he will be able to do that to far greater effect. Now, the country is got a variety of institutions. There are 50 states and 50 governors, 50 state legislatures, 2 houses of Congress. It's the system in some ways is built to be plodding and slow because of the various decentralized centers of power. However, we know that presidents can encourage action. We know that presidential words have an impact in real time in the markets and in foreign policy with other relations or relations with other nations. Trump has shown an unwillingness to check his language. And so there are a whole host of ways in which he can inflict damage that he doesn't seem to be aware of. We see in the other campaign, and again, it's not a defense of the Democratic campaign, but we have a person who seems to, at a minimum, understand the consequences of her words. So she uses her words carefully when she describes issues abroad or issues within the country that are potential lightning rods. We don't see that willingness with Trump, and I think that could inflict very serious damage.
And also, any reliance on the courts in the United States, because there's no judicial police force, depends on a president who's willing to respect the decisions of the judiciary. And we've seen before American presidents who don't. So the one that keeps coming to my mind is Andrew Jackson in the United States, who was told by the Supreme Court, you can't relocate Native Americans from across the country, and he essentially did so anyway, relying on his power as a demagogue to do that. And Trump has, in the last few weeks, been being quite nasty, actually, to a judge of Mexican ancestry, even though he was born in Indiana. So he seems like he's perfectly willing, actually, to not just ignore, but undermine the American judiciary.
Why it's so important for the world? Because obviously the United States is maybe the most important country, and when the president of the United States is in the global politics, one of the most important actors, if not the most important. So that's why I think the world is carefully watching what goes on there. On the other hand, do you think that the real threat of terrorism in America or Islam is a real danger, or not so much? My question is, like we hear, especially from Europe, then things change, and we have Brussels and Paris and things like that. And I believe that Trump also uses that in his campaign to support his argument. But what's the feeling in the US? Do you feel real threat of Islam or real threat of terrorism, or it's not there?
Well, it is the greater threat to the safety of Americans are our fellow Americans. And we have very open gun laws in the United States. It's complicated by the Second Amendment to the Constitution,
right,
but also a culture. There's a culture in the United States of gun ownership that's very hard to penetrate. And so what we've seen when there are mass shootings, for example, Trump links a lot of it to immigration. When you consider the millions of immigrants that are in the United States and the millions that are in the United States unlawfully, and then you look at the mass shootings, none of them have been perpetrated by an immigrant. They've all been perpetrated by Americans. And so I think it requires us to be sober and analytical when we view this. Presidential campaigns are not the place for sober analysis. Right. And so the last mass shooting that we have someone who is professing allegiance to ISIS. It seems in the early investigation that there was no relationship between this person and ISIS. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to investigate, but it doesn't seem like this was any kind of planned or coordinated attack. The greatest danger to us is the availability of guns in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And that has nothing to do with terrorism or radical Islamic terrorism. But because that threat is real elsewhere, and I think it is real in the United States, certainly, someone like Trump is able to fuse those fears together in a way that is really very toxic.
I would just emphasize that I think the threat of terrorism in the United States is actually quite small, and I think to the extent that it exists, it's mainly radical Christian terrorists that Americans should be worried about. Statistically, most terrorist attacks in the United States have not been by Muslims or immigrants. They've been by Americans and Christian Americans.
That's interesting. That's kind of, I think, something new, because we are also very much what we hear from TV and what we're here and how mass media actually is constructed is always emphasizing Islamic terrorists. I don't think that anyone knows anything about Christian groups in the US or Ku Klux Klan. I believe it's not anywhere in the media or somewhere.
But I think we have to distinguish between the threat and the fear of threat.
Right. So that's two different things.
Visceral feeling that we should be afraid of Muslims and immigrants. The reality is, statistically, you're much more likely to be killed by.
And today we have a referendum in Britain, so-called Brexit. So you think the results will affect your domestic politics or not really? If Britain decides to leave, for instance.
It's a great question. I mean, I'm not sure it impacts it directly, in the sense that most Americans don't, unfortunately, pay very close attention to the decisions made by other people about their external relationships. So I don't think there's probably a high degree of knowledge about what's happening in Britain today. It may indirectly impact the American election if it roils markets, for example. If it will line up the two presidential candidates differently, right? The president and Hillary Clinton would like Britain to stay in the EU. Donald Trump has been very clear that he doesn't think that they should. So there's that element of it. I think the greater impact is if it has a impact on the international economy.
Or markets.
And that could, Hillary Clinton as the inheritor of the current economy, there's some potential there, but I don't think the decision today is going to sway the American public.
Yeah, and the last thing, of course, there's so many things I'd like to discuss with you, but I also feel that it's getting hot in here. But still, I know that you are data analysts, and to a certain extent, I mean, you analyze big data also on democracy. That I think for us that's extremely interesting, because we don't have that micro data analysis used in social sciences. I believe we do use, when I say we, I mean Armenia and maybe some post-Soviet countries, we use it for maybe microeconomics or just economics research, or maybe some other areas, but we don't collect data well, first of all, and that's one of the recommendations, by the way, by UN and other commissions, that Armenia does not collect data well in order to make any predictions on policies, on anything. But we are also lacking this mechanism. So would you just tell me, just briefly, what's the idea, how you collect data, and how you implement or apply those into the social sciences, especially on democracy, just in...
Sure. So I could.
Yeah, I know that's a huge course for but still.
So it's hard, and the data is not good. So most data that we use to even inform our coding decisions about strength of a democracy, it almost always comes down to self-reported data by national governments. And so it's not democracy, but I was recently looking at a relationship between how fragile a country is and the level of homicide in that country.
Right.
And notably, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia all claim to have 0 homicides.
Right, because they don't collect any statistics.
And it's really hard to do so, right? So think about something as simple as homicide, right? So one person kills another person in an act of sociopathic violence. How do you get local police chiefs to count them all the same way, to recognize a homicide versus a killing in self-defense or a suicide, and then tabulate all of that data, which may have different definitions underlying it, into a national indicator? And that's something that actually is that we do, even in fragile countries, tend to keep track of. Now imagine you're trying to do that for GDP. You're trying to measure productivity of companies and every individual inside of your borders, and actually outside of your borders in the case of GDP. It's really hard. With democracy data, to some extent, we don't even try to collect local data at all. Regional data, only a few organizations like the IMF have tried in a few countries. We're much better in Western Europe in terms of data reliability than we are in the rest of the world, because they have more sophisticated data collection infrastructure. But when it comes to the competitiveness of democracy, there's not really a quantitative way to measure that. And so we end up relying on news reports and NGO reports and reports by organizations like CivicNet or the EPF, who try to keep track of this stuff and report out to the world the status of civil society in a country.
I see.
Of elections. But what we do is develop a set of definitions that correspond to different quantitative values. So we'll measure a country's level of or competitiveness in political participation on a scale from 1 to 3. And every person, ideally, who looks at that scale and looks at a country like Armenia would assign the same value based on the words that we use to describe Armenia, right? So what we're doing essentially is taking a complex qualitative story about an election cycle or political institutions or checks on an executive, which often can be difficult to discern, and converting that qualitative story into a set of numbers that we can apply to every country in the same way.
I understand. But now you can follow at least some trends, right? When you have all the data and it's somewhere collected, well, maybe not very correct in many cases, but still you can see some trends. So if I come to Armenia, in our region, what's the main maybe tendency or trend you can see, or it's really difficult to?
Unfortunately, it's quite grim, which I'm actually happy to say Armenia seems to be resilient to. But Armenia is in a not a good neighborhood. So over the last 10 years, we've seen the war on terror and the subsequent conflicts erupt into what increasingly looks like one traditional war that ranges from the Democratic Republic of Congo all the way north to Ukraine. There are very few countries in between, Armenia is one of them, that aren't currently actively involved in a major armed conflict with hundreds of casualties every day. So Armenia is in the middle of that, right, at the crossroads, really, between the conflicts in the Middle East and the conflicts happening in Eastern Europe and
Ukraine.
In terms of democracy, the countries around Armenia have seen steady declines in the fairness and competitiveness of elections, in checks on the executive. You see Russia experiencing a major incident of democratic backsliding under Putin's most recent term. The Ukraine is divided, and prior to division, its democracy was rapidly in decline and moving towards authoritarianism. Georgia is picking up the pieces still from the 2008 invasion. It's really quite a dangerous neighborhood. The democracy in Turkey is really only a democracy in name at this point.
Right.
Azerbaijan has never really been one. So when you consider that the neighborhood a country is in and the nature of its neighbors is one of the most important driving factors
So
behind.
you believe you cannot be a democratic country in the middle of...
It's very rare.
Yeah. And also statistics shows that. I mean,
Right.
that's kind of big data shows that you
Exactly.
cannot survive on your own. You need some environment to boost you up.
Yes, and it's not, so I can't tell you for sure that it's causal, that having autocratic neighbors makes you more likely to be autocratic. But there is reason to believe that it does. So especially if your autocratic neighbors end up doing better economically, because you're of course learning, right? States are in a lot of ways like individual organisms. They see what other countries like them are doing and they learn from that behavior. That could be good if Georgia or Turkey or Azerbaijan start learning from Armenia, I think. It could be very bad if Armenia starts learning from
I
Azerbaijan.
understand, yeah. But also just finishing and also trying to link it to American domestic politics, I would ask, would you still think that institutes or institutions are important in process of democracy? Because what we see in the United States, as you said, all these institutions, so I still believe they play this role of checks and balances, even in some critical situations. So we should maybe learn, well, US is not our neighbor, but I think it plays an important role in Armenia and influences domestic policies to a certain degree, what we can maybe learn
Sure.
from the US.
Well, and it's not just political institutions, but,
Right.
the institutions of civil society.
Absolutely.
Religious institutions, educational institutions, nonprofits, volunteer institutions, institutions of solidarity, local clubs and organizations
Right,
where
right.
people come together. So having the healthy space for those institutions to grow and thrive are also really important to democratic life.
Yeah.
And I would emphasize also the respect for institutions and trust in institutions, which in the United States is at a historic low. And when that begins to impact civil society, I think you begin to see quite negative effects. I think the institutions themselves are important, but if people don't have trust in them, don't have faith in them, there's much less incentive for politicians to respect the authority of those institutions.
Thanks so much for such an interesting discussion. I couldn't stop it because there are still lots of questions in my list, but hopefully we'll have chance to keep in contact. And thanks so much. You were watching Line of Contact Talk Show, and we had our respectful guest from the US. So keep following us, and goodbye.